"I'm not asking you to stay forever," he said, his voice cracking like drought-split earth. "Just stay through the winter." Myrtle Underwood stood at the edge of the porch with her carpetbag clutched against her chest like a shield, her knuckles pale as snow against the worn leather. The first hard frost of October 1878 had arrived overnight, and it had crystallized everything, not just the grass in the yard, not just the water in the trough, but every secret she had been keeping, every hidden motive she had arrived with, every lie she had told herself about what she was doing here in Cutter's Creek, Wyoming territory. The wind off the mountains came down in a long moan and pushed her dark hair across her face, and she did not brush it away because she did not want to look at him. She did not want to see what was in Marcus McCrae's eyes when he said something like that, because she suspected it would destroy whatever resolve she had built like a wall around herself for the past 2 months. "That is not a simple request," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." She turned then, because not turning would have been its own kind of cowardice, and she found exactly what she had feared she would find. Marcus McCrae was standing in the doorway of his ranch house, his hat in his hands, turning the brim in slow circles the way he always did when he was holding something back. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that weather had marked honestly rather than cruelly. There was a cut above his left eyebrow, still raw, from the incident 3 nights ago that had sent everything spiraling into this confrontation. His dark eyes were steady on her, not pleading, not commanding, which was somehow worse than either of those things. "If I stay," she said, "it will not mean what you want it to mean." "Maybe not right now," he said. She looked at him for a long moment in which the wind screamed between them and a horse in the stable stamped and blew, and somewhere a shutter banged against the side of the house. Then she set her carpetbag down on the porch. Not inside, not in the yard. On the porch, which was neither departure nor return, which was the most honest thing she had managed since she arrived in Cutter's Creek 4 months ago under entirely false pretenses, with a name that was only half her own and a past she had never intended to share with anyone. She would stay through the winter. She did not know yet that, by the time the ice broke on Cutter's Creek, she would not be capable of leaving. But that is not where the story begins. It begins in August, in the suffocating heat of a Union Pacific train car, with a letter Myrtle Underwood should never have answered. She had been living in Cheyenne for 14 months when she saw the advertisement in the Wyoming Tribune. It was the kind of advertisement that unmarried women of limited means read with a mixture of longing and suspicion, posted by a rancher in a small mountain community seeking a woman of good character to assist with the management of a household through the winter months, with the possibility of permanent arrangement thereafter. The post was worded carefully enough that it could not quite be called a mail-order bride advertisement, though that was plainly what it was. There was something in the phrasing, though, something careful and a little uncertain, that kept Myrtle from throwing the newspaper into the stove the way she usually did when she encountered such notices. She was not in Cheyenne by choice. She was in Cheyenne because it was the last place anyone who was looking for her would think to find her, and she had run out of places that were more comfortable. She had come west from St. Louis 2 years before that, in the spring of 1876, when her brother Clarence's debts had become dangerous in a very specific way, and the man those debts were owed to had made it clear that a young woman living alone was not in a position to negotiate. She had taken $60 and a single trunk and gotten on a train without a forwarding address. She had been a school teacher in St. Louis. She had her education, her intelligence, a quality that people often described as self-possession, and a stubborn refusal to be afraid of things she understood. In Cheyenne, she had found work as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant named Absalom Hewitt, a widower of 57 who had been perfectly decent to her for the first 18 months, and then had proposed marriage in a way that made it clear he considered her acceptance inevitable. When she declined him, he had let her go with 2 weeks of wages, and a reference letter so lukewarm it was nearly useless. So she had the letter from the rancher in Cutter's Creek. She had $14, 3 week-old bread rolls, and a growing certainty that if she did not take some kind of chance she would calcify entirely, alone in a rented room, and no one would notice until the rent came due. She answered the advertisement. What she did not do was answer it entirely honestly. She described herself as a widow, which she was not. She described herself as having experience managing a household of 12, which was only true if you counted the boarding house where she had lived in St. Louis for 6 months. She described her character as settled and domestic, which was so far from the truth that writing it down made her press her lips together. She signed the letter as Myrtle Underwood, which was her actual name, but she gave no history, no family connections, no mention of Clarence or his debts or the man in St. Louis whose name she still could not think about without her hands going cold. The reply came in 10 days. It was written in a clear, deliberate hand, not elegant, not educated in the formal sense, but precise. The rancher's name was Marcus McCrae. He owned 600 acres in the foothills of the Laramie Range, a cattle operation he had built over 8 years from nothing, a house he had built himself, and a reputation in Cutter's Creek that he described, without apparent vanity, as honest. He had been married once, he wrote. His wife had died in the winter of 1875 from a fever that the nearest doctor had not arrived in time to treat. He did not dwell on this. He said only that the house had been without a woman's presence for 3 years, and that he had become aware, in ways he found difficult to enumerate, that this was affecting the quality of his life and his work. He was not lyrical about it. He did not promise her anything extravagant. What he said, in the plain language of a man who dealt in cattle and cold weather and hard seasons, was that he needed someone competent and honest, that he would treat her with respect, that the arrangement could end at her discretion, and that if it developed into something more permanent, that would be a matter of mutual choice. Myrtle read the letter 3 times and identified in herself an emotion she had been suppressing for 2 years. It was something very close to hope, and it frightened her badly, which was probably why she got on the train. She arrived at Cutter's Creek on a Thursday afternoon in late August, when the Wyoming sky was so blue it looked painted, and the mountain stood up against it like a boast. The town was small, the kind of small that had ambitions it had not yet been able to fulfill, with a main street of perhaps 8 buildings including a general store, a saloon that was also apparently a hotel, a church that was also apparently a school 1 day a week, and a land office that sat at the end of the street with an air of quiet importance. There were perhaps 200 people in the surrounding area, ranchers and farmers and their families, a handful of single men who worked the mines up in the hills, and a general understanding that everyone knew everyone's business. Marcus McCrae met her at the small depot, which was less a depot than a wooden platform with a roof, and she recognized him not because she had any description of him, but because he was the only man there who was holding his hat in his hands and turning the brim in circles. She would come to know that gesture very well. He was taller than she had imagined, which was somehow reassuring. He had dark hair going slightly gray at the temples, which had not been mentioned in any of his letters, and eyes so dark they were nearly black, which were focused on her with an expression of careful assessment that she recognized, because it was exactly what she was doing to him. "Miss Underwood," he said. "Mr. McCrae," she said. They shook hands. His was calloused and warm. Hers was gloved, and she was grateful for that because she was more nervous than she had admitted to herself. He had brought a wagon, which they loaded with her trunk and her carpetbag, and they drove the 6 miles to his property in a silence that was not comfortable but was at least honest. He pointed out landmarks, the ridge that marked the northern edge of his land, the creek that gave the town its name, though it ran south of the town and was not visible from the road, the remains of what had been a homesteader's cabin, abandoned years before he arrived, which was slowly becoming part of the ground it stood on. "There are things I should tell you," Myrtle said, when they were perhaps a mile from his house and the silence had become weighted enough that she felt she should do something about it. "Probably," he agreed. "About my history," she said. "The letter I wrote was not entirely accurate." He was quiet for a moment, watching the road. Were any of the important things accurate? She thought about that. "My name is genuine. My desire to do honest work is genuine. My willingness to manage a household is genuine if slightly overstated." "How slightly?" "Significantly," she admitted. She heard something change in his breathing, and then she realized he was laughing quietly, not unkindly, just with the restrained amusement of a man who had expected something and gotten something different but was not sure yet whether the difference was bad. "All right," he said. "We can work with that." She looked at his profile and felt the first stirring of something she would spend the next several weeks insisting to herself was only gratitude. His property was finer than she had allowed herself to imagine. The house was solid and well built, 2 stories of timber frame with a covered porch running along the front. There was a vegetable garden to the east, a stable and a corral, a bunkhouse for the 2 hired hands who worked the operation with him, a smokehouse and a root cellar. The mountains rose behind it all in a wall of dark pine, and the late afternoon light made everything gold. She stood in the yard for a moment looking at it and felt, without meaning to, that it was the kind of place a person would not easily leave. "It is a beautiful property," she said. "It is a working one," he said, but there was something private in his voice when he said it, like a man who has been given a compliment about something he cares about and is trying not to show how much the compliment lands. He introduced her to his hired men, Thomas Bray and a younger man of mixed heritage named Samuel Crow, who was perhaps 22, polite and quiet with a reserve that Myrtle recognized as being less about shyness than about the careful positioning of a man who has learned that not everyone in Wyoming territory is neutral about his existence. She treated him with the straightforward courtesy she offered everyone and noted with satisfaction the way some of the wariness left his expression. Her room was on the 2nd floor. It was simple but clean, with a window that faced the mountains and a washstand and a quilt on the bed that had clearly been made by someone who knew what they were doing. She would later learn that it had been his wife's work. She stood in that room on the first night and tried to talk herself into feeling only the practical dimensions of her situation. She was employed. She had a safe place to sleep. She had made an arrangement with a man who appeared to be decent and was at minimum not frightening. These were measurable goods, and she should measure them and go to bed. What she should not do was stand at the window looking at the mountains going dark against a sky full of stars and feel as though something she had long believed was permanently closed inside her, was showing the faintest evidence of a crack. She went to bed and told herself it was the mountain air. The work was harder than she had made it sound in her letter, and easier than she had feared. She learned quickly, which had always been true of her. She learned that a wood stove required more management than an eastern coal furnace, that water had to be drawn from the well and not turned on from a tap, that bread made at altitude required adjustments she had to work out through several early failures she was embarrassed to think about. She learned the rhythms of a ranch, the early rising, the heavy physical labor, the particular silences of midday and the different particular silences of evening when the work was done and the animals were settled. Marcus was patient with her failures in a way that managed not to be condescending, which she found remarkable. He did not hover. He did not suggest she was incapable. He offered information when she asked for it, and occasionally when she had not asked but clearly needed it, and he had the wisdom to walk away immediately after, giving her room to apply what she had learned without an audience. She began, in those first weeks, to understand him in small pieces. He woke before dawn every day and walked the perimeter of the near pasture alone before breakfast, which she eventually understood was less about inspection and more about something he needed, some private counsel with himself and the land. He drank his coffee black and without sugar, which she noted mentally when she stocked the pantry. He read at night, which surprised her. He had a small collection of books that showed genuine evidence of use, not the decorative volumes of a man who wanted to appear educated, but the worn, annotated copies of a man who had worked through ideas over many evenings. There was a Bible. There was a book on cattle management. There was a copy of Oliver Twist, which she had read herself in St. Louis and which she found with a turned-down page near the middle as though he had set it down in the middle of a difficult passage and not yet found the resolve to pick it back up. She could not help herself. She read it, the whole thing, in 2 evenings by the lamp in her room. When she went back downstairs and replaced it on his shelf, she found him watching her from the table where he was cleaning a bridle with leather oil. "Good?" he asked. "I read it in St. Louis," she said. "I was glad to read it again. It is better than I remembered." "The part with the coffin maker's wife," he said. "I keep stopping there." She knew the passage. The woman, exhausted and half-starved, beaten down to her final days, still finding something defiant to say to the man who had worn her down to nothing. "She does not give up," Myrtle said. "No," he said. "She does not." There was a pause in which neither of them spoke, and in which Myrtle became aware of something shifting under the surface of the conversation, something neither of them was equipped yet to address directly. She said good night and went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her hands together in her lap, and told herself with some severity that she had come to this arrangement under false pretenses, that she carried a secret that could rupture everything, and that the worst possible outcome of this situation would be to start feeling things she could not sustain. She was very convincing. She did not believe herself at all. September moved in with a sweetness that Wyoming permitted only briefly, the aspen going gold on the hillsides, the air carrying a bite in the mornings that receded into warmth by midday. They fell into a routine that had, without either of them designing it, become a partnership. She managed the house. He managed the cattle and the land, but the lines blurred in the practical ways that life on a working ranch demands, and she found herself outside more than she had expected, learning things that had not been in any Eastern woman's curriculum. She learned to ride, which Marcus taught her with the same patient, non-hovering approach he applied to everything. She made several undignified acquaintances with the ground before she got it right, and he pretended with beautiful consistency not to have noticed any of them. She learned to read the weather coming off the mountains. She learned the names of all 12 horses, which the horses themselves seemed to appreciate, responding to her with the particularly generous tolerance that horses extend to people who are willing to pay attention. Thomas Bray was a taciturn man of 40-odd years who had worked cattle all his life, and regarded Myrtle with the polite neutrality of someone who had seen ranchers' arrangements come and go and was reserving judgment. Samuel Crow was warmer, gradually, once he had established that she was not going to treat him as less than what he was. He had grown up on the frontier with a Lakota mother and a Welsh miner father who had died when Samuel was 12, and he had found his way to McCrae's operation 4 years before through a series of circumstances he described in partial, self-deprecating summaries that she suspected concealed a harder story. She did not press. She understood the value of not pressing. By mid-September, she and Marcus had achieved something that she struggled to name correctly. It was not friendship, exactly. It was not the employer and employee dynamic that the practical architecture of their arrangement suggested it should be. It was something more collaborative than either of those, with a quality of attention between them that she recognized was particular. He listened to her when she spoke, not in the half-present way of a man managing a woman's contribution, but with the full, focused interest of someone who found what she had to say genuinely worth hearing. And she found herself, against all her previous training in self-containment, telling him things. Not the important things, not the hidden motive she had arrived with, not the secret, but the edges of her true self began to show in those September evenings when the day's work was done, and they sat at the kitchen table after supper and talked. She told him about growing up in Ohio with her mother and her brother Clarence, who had always been charming and careless in equal measure, and who she had loved with the particular exhausted devotion of the more responsible sibling. She told him about her education, about the teaching position she had held in St. Louis, about the books she had loved. She told him about the reason she had left in the careful version, the safe version, the version that stopped well short of the name she was not yet ready to say out loud. He listened to all of it, and then, in the manner of a man who understood reciprocity, he told her things in return. He had grown up in Texas, the second of 5 children, on a hardscrabble ranch that had always been one bad season away from dissolution. He had come north after the war, not because he had served. He was 14 when the war ended, but because the south of Texas in 1865 was a place where a young man with ambition and no capital had very limited options. He had worked cattle for other men for 8 years, saving carefully, and had staked his claim in Wyoming in 1870. He had built the first structure on his land with his own hands, a single-room shelter he had lived in for 2 winters before the house existed. He had married a leaner in 1872, a woman from the territory whose family had a neighboring claim. She had died in January of 1875. He said a leaner's name without flinching, but also without ease, in the way of a man who has made peace with something that still costs him something every time he touches it. Myrtle noted the care he took, and she noted that he did not talk about a leaner beyond those facts, and she was wise enough to understand that this was not because a leaner did not matter, but precisely because she did. It was in the second week of September that Myrtle's hidden trouble found her. She had gone to the general store in town to lay in supplies for the next month, driving the wagon herself with a competence she was quietly pleased by. She was loading flour sacks into the wagon bed when a man came out of the saloon across the street and stopped on the boardwalk and looked at her. She knew him immediately. She had hoped never to see him again. His name was Franklin Dre. He was 45 years old, broad through the middle, with a neat mustache and the kind of well-dressed, well-fed appearance that in eastern cities passed for prosperity, and in this setting simply looked foreign. He had been the man to whom Clarence's debts were owed. He had been the reason she had gotten on a train west. He had been, she had believed, safely 2,000 miles behind her in St. Louis. He looked at her across the street of Cutter's Creek, Wyoming territory, and he smiled. "Well now," he said, crossing toward her, "that is a remarkable thing." Myrtle set down the flour sack with careful hands and faced him. The 2 years of building herself back up in strange places, of living carefully and quietly and without claim, crystallized in her into something very cold and very steady. "Mr. Dre," she said, "I have been wondering where you went," he said pleasantly. He stopped at a conversational distance and looked at her with the assessment of a man who has always regarded human beings as resources to be managed. "Your brother still owes me money, Miss Underwood. I was hoping you might know something about that." "Clarence's debts are Clarence's business," she said. "He made it your business when he disappeared, and you disappeared the same week," Franklin Dre said, still pleasantly. "You understand how that looks." She did. It looked like she had helped Clarence run, which she had. She had bought his train ticket with 30 of her $60 and told him to go as far as the money took him and not write to her, ever, and she had never heard from him again. She did not know if he was alive. She had made peace with not knowing because knowing would have meant contact, and contact was what Franklin Dre would follow. "I do not know where my brother is," she said, which was the truth. "I have not seen or heard from him in 2 years." "That is unfortunate," Dre said. He let his gaze move over her in the appraising way she had always found nauseating, then looked up toward the direction of Marcus's ranch. "I heard you have taken up with the McCrae operation." "That is interesting. McCrae has something of a reputation in this territory." He paused. "I wonder if he knows the full details of who he has brought onto his property." There it was, the trap, the threat dressed in a pleasant voice and a neat mustache. "I am sure you will tell me what you want," Myrtle said. "I want what your brother owes me," Dre said. Since he is apparently unavailable, I am willing to be flexible about how that debt is settled." She looked at him and felt the contempt rise in her like clean water in a well. "I will not do whatever you are implying," she said. Dre shrugged. "Then I suppose I will just have a friendly conversation with Mr. McCrae about the woman he has living under his roof." She drove back to the ranch in a controlled fury, her hands steady on the reins, her mind moving through scenarios with the efficiency that had always been her greatest practical asset. By the time she unharnessed the horse and brushed him down with the mechanical motions of a person keeping their hands busy while their mind works, she had reached two conclusions. The first was that she had to tell Marcus. The second was that telling Marcus would almost certainly end the arrangement. Because she had arrived under false pretenses, she had a dangerous man pursuing her, and she had brought that danger to a property that was not hers. Both conclusions were true. They were also in direct conflict with something she had been refusing to name but could no longer pretend was not there. She had told herself, that first night in the room with the view of the mountains, that she should not feel things she could not sustain. She had not listened. By mid-September, with the aspens gold and Marcus McCrae handing her a cup of coffee in the mornings with something in his expression she was too self-honest to misread, she was running at a feeling the size of a mountain, and she was furious with herself about it. She found him at the corral after she had put away the supplies, patching a section of rail that had worked loose. The light was going amber and long the way it did in September late afternoons, and she stood by the fence and looked at the line of his shoulders as he worked and felt the whole weight of what she had to confess settle into her like cold iron. "I need to tell you something," she said. He set down his tools and turned to look at her, reading her expression with the directness that was characteristic of him. He waited. She told him everything. Not the careful version, not the safe version. The actual version. Clarence, the gambling debts, Franklin Dre, the threats that had been implied before she left St. Louis, the false advertising in her letter, the widow lie, the household management lie, all of it. She did not soften any of it. She watched his face as she spoke, and saw the sequence of reactions move through him, surprise, then something harder and more careful, then something she could not quite read, and she told herself she was watching the end of the arrangement and the end of whatever foolish growth she had allowed to happen inside her chest, and that she deserved every bit of the consequence. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The horses moved in the corral. Somewhere on the hillside, a hawk screamed. "He threatened to tell me," Marcus said finally. "Yes." "And you came to tell me first." "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him, and the honest answer was the only one she had. "Because I respect you enough to tell you the truth before he poisons it." He looked at the corral rail. He picked up his mallet and turned it in his hands. She waited for him to tell her to go, to call for Thomas Bray to help load her trunk, to look at her with the particular disappointment of a man who has been deceived and will not forgive it. "Tell me about Dre," he said. "Not Clarence. Dre, how dangerous is he?" She blinked. This was not the conversation she had been prepared for. "He is the kind of man who has never needed to be physically violent himself because he employs people for that purpose," she said. "In St. Louis he controlled 3 blocks of property through debt. He was considered respectable. He was considered the kind of man you did not cross." Marcus nodded slowly. "He is not in St. Louis now," he said. "He is in Cutter's Creek." "Yes." "Which means either he came specifically looking for you, or he is here for another reason and found you by chance." He looked at her. "Which do you think?" She had not thought to consider this distinction. She thought about it now. "He seemed surprised to see me," she said slowly. "Pleased but surprised." "I think it was the second one, but he will use it regardless." "Dre has been in Cutter's Creek for 3 days," Marcus said. "I heard his name from Thomas this morning. There has been talk about a land consolidation scheme, buying up water rights on several smaller claims near the creek bed. Several families have already been approached." Myrtle felt the picture rearrange itself in her mind. Dre had not come for her. But Dre had found her, and now she was both a personal tool and potential leverage he had not anticipated having. "I am sorry," she said. "I did not intend to bring this to your door." "You did not bring it," he said flatly. "He brought it. You are not responsible for what a man like that does." He looked at her with a directness that she felt in the center of her chest. "What I want to know is whether you planned to tell me before or after he showed up." This was the right question, and she was not going to lie about the answer. "I planned to tell you when I found a way to tell you that did not make everything else collapse," she said. "Which was cowardly, and I know it." He nodded, said nothing, picked up his mallet and drove 2 nails into the fence rail with precise, economical strikes. Then he said, "I am not sending you away, Marcus." "I am not sending you away," he said again, not loudly, but with the finality of a man who has made a decision in the deep part of himself and will not be argued out of it at the surface. "You came to me with honesty when you had a choice, and that matters. As for Dre, I have dealt with men who use debt as a weapon before. He is not the first and he will not be the last, and he picked the wrong territory to run his scheme in." She looked at him and felt something crack through the wall she had been building so carefully, something warm and terrifying in equal measure. "I do not want you to take on my troubles," she said. "You are on my property," he said simply. "Your troubles are my troubles." She would think about those words for days afterward. The matter-of-fact ownership in them, the lack of drama or condescension, the plain-spoken declaration that he had chosen to include her in the circle of what he considered his responsibility. It was not romantic language. It was far more powerful than romantic language. The matter of Franklin Dre did not resolve itself quickly or neatly, because things that involve men like Franklin Dre never do. Over the following 2 weeks, Dre began a careful, methodical campaign of pressure against the smaller property holders near the creek. He had the legal precision of a man who had been doing this in various forms his whole adult life, approaching with apparently fair offers, letting the offers sit, then applying quiet pressure through back channels, through gossip, through the particular suggestion that a man who declined to sell might find his water access becoming complicated. 2 families sold. One did not. A stubborn German farmer named Heinrich Brauer, who had been on his claim for 6 years, and was not the type to be pressured by anyone, and who came to Marcus one evening to discuss the situation with the directness of a man who had survived harder things than Franklin Dre. Myrtle sat at the kitchen table while Marcus and Heinrich Brauer talked, and she took notes, because she had a bookkeeper's precision with details and a lawyer's instinct for the kind of record that would matter her later. She wrote down dates, offers, amounts, the names of the other property holders, and what they had been told. She wrote down what she knew about Dre's methods from St. Louis, which was more than she had shared with Marcus in her initial confession. She had a good memory, and she had been paying very close attention to Dre's operations in the years before she had been forced to run. When Heinrich Brauer left, Marcus looked at the pages she had covered in her neat, careful handwriting. He read through them slowly, then he looked up at her. "You were his bookkeeper," he said. She had been, not officially, not in any way she had consented to. She had been keeping Absalom Hewitt's books in Cheyenne, and before that she had been keeping her own records, because she had witnessed in St. Louis the way Dre operated, and she had understood, with the instinct of a woman who reads people quickly, that knowing the details of his operations was the only insurance she had. She had kept notes for 2 years in a small ledger that she still had in her carpetbag upstairs, and those notes documented transactions that Franklin Dre would very much prefer not to become public knowledge. "Not officially," she said, "but I watched him carefully for 2 years in St. Louis because I understood it might matter someday." Marcus looked at her in a way she was beginning to recognize as a particular mode of attention, the kind where he was revising his understanding of her upward and was not embarrassed to let her see it. "You came to Wyoming with evidence against him," he said. "I came to Wyoming to get away from him," she corrected. The evidence was protection. I did not think I would ever need to use it. And now, she looked at the notes she had taken, at the names of the families Dre was squeezing, at the record of methods and figures she had kept in that small ledger for 2 years. Now, she said, I think I might need to use it. It was at this point that the situation required something Myrtle had not anticipated, the involvement of the Territorial Land Office and, by extension, the county sheriff. This was not a development she sought eagerly, because involving official structures also meant exposing her own history more fully, and the possibility that her deceptions, while not illegal, would become a matter of public record in a community where public record was everything. But Marcus went with her to the sheriff's office in Cutter's Creek on a Thursday morning with her ledger and her notes, and he stood beside her while she laid it all out for a methodical, fair-minded man named Sheriff Amos Pollard, who listened without interrupting, asked 3 precise questions at the end, and spent the following 10 days working quietly through official channels. Franklin Dre was confronted with the ledger evidence in the second week of October. He was a man who controlled situations through other men's fear, and he had not fully accounted for the possibility that he would encounter a woman who had been watching him and writing it all down. He attempted briefly to suggest that the evidence was fabricated. Sheriff Pollard, who had by then corroborated enough of it through the land office records, was not persuaded. Dre was required to reverse the water rights transactions he had forced through improper pressure. He left Cutter's Creek 2 days later with the particular tight-shouldered dignity of a man who is not accustomed to losing and is making elaborate internal plans for revenge that he will never follow through on because he has, at his core, the coward's absolute avoidance of situations where he does not already hold all the advantages. Myrtle stood on the main street of Cutter's Creek and watched his wagon disappear toward the eastern road and felt, for the first time in 2 years, the specific physical sensation of a weight she had stopped noticing because she had been carrying it so long leaving her body. She was standing there in the October light, the mountains behind the town brilliant with the first patches of early snow on the higher peaks, when she became aware of Marcus standing beside her. He had been a few steps back, giving her the moment, and then he had moved to stand beside her, not touching her, just present. She could feel the warmth of him in the cold air. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he agreed. She turned to look at him and found him already looking at her, and the thing that had been building between them since the first morning on the wagon road from the depot, the thing she had been refusing to name, was present in the space between them with a clarity that the October air seemed to amplify. She looked at his face, at the honesty she had come to rely on in it, at the steadiness that had been the framework she had leaned against through the worst of the past 2 weeks, and she felt the wall she had built around herself shudder. She said nothing. He said nothing. They walked back to the wagon and drove home in a silence that was entirely different from the one on the road from the depot, which had been the silence of 2 strangers. This one was the silence of 2 people who know each other and have not yet found the words for what that knowledge means. The next several weeks were the ones that Myrtle would remember for the rest of her life as the period when she stopped fighting herself and started simply living. October settled over the Laramie Range with the authority of a season that knows what it is doing. The garden was harvested and put up. The root cellar was stocked with the methodical care of people who understood what Wyoming winters required. The cattle were worked down from the higher summer pasture to the winter range nearer the house, a process that took 3 hard days and in which Myrtle participated more than anyone had expected, riding with Marcus and Thomas and Samuel across the high meadows with the aspens stripped down to their white bones and the sky deep blue overhead, working the herd with a competence she had built over 2 months from nothing. On the last evening of that cattle drive, they camped on the high pasture because it was too dark and too far to ride back. Thomas and Samuel set up their bedrolls on one side of the fire. Marcus set up his on the other, and Myrtle sat near the fire wrapped in a heavy blanket and Marcus's spare coat and looked at the stars, which at this altitude were outrageous. Not the polite scattering of stars she had known in St. Louis, but an extravagance, a whole argument for the infinite made visible. "I did not expect this," she said. Marcus was beside her, not quite close enough to be improper, close enough to share the warmth of the fire. "What did you expect?" "I expected a practical arrangement," she said. "I expected to keep a house and perhaps eventually be honest enough about my history to see if a permanent arrangement was possible. I expected to feel settled. I did not expect to feel," she paused, because the word she was reaching for was enormous and she had not used it in a long time, not seriously, not about something real. "What?" he said quietly. She looked at the fire. "Like myself," she said. "I did not expect to feel like myself." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Who did you feel like before?" "Someone surviving," she said. "Someone managing. There is a difference." "Yes," he said, "there is." She looked at him sideways in the firelight and found him watching the mountains. There was something in his face that she had not seen before, or perhaps she had seen it and not been willing to read it. It was the face of a man who is feeling something large and is deciding what to do about it. "Marcus," she said. "I am not going to say anything that will make you feel trapped," he said, in the particular way of a man who has thought about exactly what to say and is saying it with the care it deserves. "I know you came here because you needed somewhere. I know that is a different thing from choosing to be here." "I chose to answer your letter," she said, "for practical reasons." "Initially," she admitted. Then because she was no longer in the habit of the careful version, "Not anymore." The fire popped and sent sparks up into the enormous cold sky, and he turned to look at her and she met his look without the wall, for the first time without the careful management that had been her armor for 2 years. She saw him see this. She watched something in his face change, the careful restraint giving way to something open and real and a little frightened in the best way. He took her hand. She let him. They sat by the fire in the high meadow with the stars overhead and the cattle settling for the night and Thomas and Samuel diplomatically and thoroughly asleep, and did not need to say anything else. He kissed her the first time 3 days later, on the porch in the early morning before anyone else was awake, with the frost on the grass and the mountains going pink in the first light. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was the most deliberate thing she had ever experienced. His hand came up to her face, and he looked at her for a moment with that full, complete attention she had come to understand was his particular way of honoring things he cared about. And then he kissed her quietly and thoroughly, and when he pulled back, she stood there in the cold pink morning and felt something she had forgotten was possible. She felt safe. Not the provisional safety of a woman who has run to the right town. Not the safety of a locked room or a careful alias. The deep safety of being known, honestly, by someone who has made a choice about you with all the information in front of them. She might have cried a little, and he had the grace to pretend not to notice. What she did not expect was that the happiness of those October days would be interrupted by trouble she had not anticipated. Trouble that came not from Franklin Dre or her brother's debts, or any of the past she had been running from, but from something new, something closer to home. The trouble arrived in the person of a man named Cole Harrow, who rode onto Marcus's property on a Wednesday morning in late October with a contract that claimed a purchase agreement on the water rights to Cutter's Creek's eastern tributary. This contract purported to have Marcus McCrae's signature on it and was dated 6 months prior, before Myrtle had arrived, and it sold those rights for a fraction of their worth to a land-holding company that, when Myrtle looked at the documents with her bookkeeper's eye, had no clear origin and no verifiable principle. Marcus looked at the signature on the contract and said, very quietly, "That is not my signature." Cole Harrow was a man in his 30s, lean and leather-faced, with the patient manner of a man who has delivered bad news many times, and found that patience serves better than aggression. He said he had been engaged by the holding company in good faith to present the contract, and that if there was a dispute about the authenticity of the signature, that would be a matter for the land office to sort out. After he left, Myrtle sat down with the documents and Marcus sat across from her, and they went through every line. The paper was genuine, the seal was genuine, and the signature was a very good forgery, the kind of forgery that would have fooled anyone who had not seen enough of Marcus's actual handwriting to know where the slight pressure variations were wrong. She had seen enough. "Someone who has access to your signature made this," she said. "Someone who has seen enough of your writing to copy it closely." Marcus went still in the particular way she had come to recognize as his processing mode. "The land office," he said. "I signed deeds there when I bought the last parcel east of the creek, 3 years ago." "Who worked the land office then?" He looked at her. "A clerk named Josiah Pell. He moved on 6 months ago." A pause. "He moved on around the time that contract is dated." Myrtle wrote down Josiah Pell's name. "The investigation of the forged contract took 2 weeks. 2 weeks in which the property hung in a kind of suspended uncertainty. Because a contract with a forged signature that was nonetheless technically active meant that Marcus's water rights were in dispute, and the cattle operation depended on those water rights through the winter. 2 weeks in which Myrtle worked with a focused, cold-eyed determination that she discovered she was very good at, writing letters to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, cross-referencing Josiah Pell's employment record with the dates on the contract, compiling a documentation file that Sheriff Pollard eventually used to secure a court date in the county seat." Thomas Bray, who had been watching all of this with the silent observation of a man who is revising his estimate of a person, said to Myrtle one morning in the stable, while they were both doing their separate tasks, "You are something else entirely, Miss Underwood." "Mrs." she said without thinking, and then caught herself because she was not Marcus's wife, and the assumption had come out of some internal place that was moving ahead of her actual situation. Thomas looked at her with something that on a less taciturn face would have been a smile. "Not yet," he said, and went back to cleaning his tack. Myrtle stood in the stable with a brush in her hand and felt her face go warm in the cold morning air, and refused to do anything about that feeling except note its existence and go back to brushing the horse. The court date resolved the water rights question conclusively. Josiah Pell was located in a town 60 miles east where he had found work with, naturally, a land-holding company. The testimony of 3 people who had seen Marcus's actual signature demonstrated the forgery. The contract was nullified. The water rights remained with the McCrae operation. It was the 2nd week of November when they drove back from the county seat, the 2 of them in the wagon with the first real snow dusting the road ahead of them, and the mountains already white above the timber line. Myrtle had the folder of court documents on her lap and was reviewing them for the 3rd time out of pure procedural satisfaction, making sure everything was in order, noting what needed to be filed where. "You can stop," Marcus said. "I want to make sure, Myrtle." He said her name in the tone he used when he was being patient with her tendency toward thoroughness. "It is done." She looked up from the folder. The road ahead was white and quiet, the pine trees carrying snow, the sky the low gray of a serious winter settling in. The horses moved steadily through it, breath steaming in the cold air. It was a landscape she had not grown up in and would not have imagined choosing, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She put the folder away. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said after several minutes. She looked at him. He was watching the road, not looking at her, which was how he approached things that required care. "When you arrived in August," he said, "I had not written to any other women. You were the only one I wrote to." She had wondered about this. The advertisement had not specified an exclusive correspondence, and she had assumed she was one of several candidates. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Your letter," he said. "There was something in the way you wrote, something careful that had I do not have the right word, a quality of a person who was thinking hard about something they actually meant. Most letters I received were performances. Yours felt like an argument you were having with yourself." She thought about the night she had written that letter, the $14, the 3 bread rolls, the stove she had almost thrown the newspaper into. "It was," she said. "I thought," he paused, and turned the reins in his hands in the gesture she knew so well. "I thought that anyone arguing with themselves that hard about whether to answer an advertisement for a stranger in Wyoming territory was someone who had a lot to lose and had made a real choice about risking it. That is the kind of person I wanted on my property." She looked at his profile in the gray November light and felt the deep warmth of being understood by someone who has been paying attention from the beginning. "And now," she said. He turned to look at her then fully, with both of them rocking slightly with the motion of the wagon. "Now," he said, "you are the kind of person I want in my house, for reasons that have nothing to do with the property." She reached across the seat and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers immediately, firmly, with the certainty of a man who has been waiting for this specific action and is not going to be tentative about it now that it has arrived. They drove the rest of the way home in a silence that was entirely, completely happy. It was 3 days later that the first real crisis of what they were becoming happened, and it was precipitated not by external enemies, but by the harder and more intimate territory of two people who have both been lonely and hurt for a long time trying to navigate toward each other without causing damage. It began over an entirely ordinary disagreement about the cattle, about moving a specific group of yearlings to a protected pasture before the next expected snowfall. Myrtle had made a practical suggestion based on 2 months of careful observation and a genuine understanding of the operation. Marcus had disagreed with her suggestion. She had pushed back. He had responded not unkindly, but with the authority of a man who has been making these decisions alone for 8 years and defaults, under pressure, to the assumption of his own singular expertise. She had said nothing else. She had completed the tasks of the day with perfect efficiency and gone to bed without speaking to him again. He had knocked on her door that night. She had not answered because she was not ready, and also because she was working through the specific variety of anger that comes from having offered something real and had it reduced to a suggestion from someone without experience. In the morning she came down and he was already at the table, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent an uncomfortable night. "I handled that poorly," he said. She sat down across from him and poured herself coffee. "Yes," she said. "I have been running this operation alone for 8 years," he said. "That is not an excuse, it is an explanation." "I know the difference between an excuse and an explanation," she said. "Then you know I am not asking you to accept one," he said. "I am telling you that I am aware of a habit in myself that I want to change, because I would rather change it than lose what is becoming possible here." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the gray morning light with the smell of coffee and the sound of the stove, and felt the complexity of loving a real person, not a hope or a projection or a careful idea of someone, but a real human being who had faults and history and deeply ingrained patterns, and who was sitting in front of her asking to be better at the explicit cost of his pride. "The yearlings should be moved today," she said. "There is a hard front coming." "I know," he said. "We will move them this morning." She hid her smile in her coffee cup, but not very effectively. November became December with the accelerating momentum that winter carries in high country, each day shorter and colder than the one before, the world outside the windows going white and staying white. The rhythm of the ranch became the harder rhythm of winter operations. Livestock maintenance, wood splitting, the constant management of feed and water, and the internal temperature of the house that became, in genuinely cold weather, a daily negotiation with a Wyoming winter that had strong opinions about the matter. It was during this period that Marcus's younger sister arrived unexpectedly, driving herself up the road in a hired wagon from the Cutter's Creek Depot with 4 bags and a fidgety determination. Her name was Ruth McCrae. She was 26, and she had come from Texas because their mother had been ill in October and had recovered, but the experience had unnerved Ruth, and made her feel the distance from her brother sharply. She had also, Myrtle gathered within the first hour of meeting her, been following the situation in Cutter's Creek through Marcus's letters, and had formed opinions about Myrtle Underwood that she had arrived to verify in person. Ruth McCrae was not subtle. She was warm and direct, and entirely willing to ask questions that most women would have phrased as implications. By the end of the first day, she had asked Myrtle about her family, her education, her previous employment, her feelings about Wyoming, and what her intentions were. Myrtle answered all of it honestly, including the parts about the false advertising in her original letter and the matter of Franklin Dre, because she had found that honesty cost less than she had once believed and paid better than any other currency. Ruth listened to all of it with the focused attention that Myrtle recognized as a family trait, and at the end of it she said, "My brother wrote to me about you 3 times in September. He has never written to me about a woman more than once." She paused. "He told me about his water rights dispute and about the forged signature, but mostly the letters were about you. He did not realize that was what they were about." "Did you tell him?" Myrtle said. "Of course not," Ruth said. "Some things a man has to find out for himself." Myrtle liked Ruth McCrae with an immediacy that felt like being given something she had not known she was missing. She had been without any family, any true personal connection for 2 years. The particular ease of Ruth's company, the warmth of a woman who had no agenda except genuine curiosity, was the kind of nourishment that had been absent from her life for so long she had stopped knowing it was absent. Ruth stayed for 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks she and Myrtle talked for hours in the evenings while Marcus read or worked at the table, with the comfortable domesticity of people who have found their way to each other. She told Myrtle about Marcus as a child, about the ranch in Texas, about their mother, about the years after Alina died when Marcus had gone very quiet and very focused, and had worried everyone who loved him with his particular kind of functioning grief. "He has not been like this since before Alina," Ruth told her one evening, in a low voice while Marcus was outside. "This easy. He has been here, he has been good, but there has been something reserved. Something behind glass." She looked at Myrtle steadily. "You have taken it away." Myrtle held her coffee cup. "I am not sure I have done anything," she said. "That," Ruth said, "is how I know you are the right person." When Ruth left 2 days before Christmas, she hugged Myrtle on the porch in the biting cold with the fierce grip of a woman who has decided to claim someone as family and is making it official. Myrtle held on and did not embarrass herself quite, but it was close. Christmas on the McCrae property was a quiet thing, just the 2 of them and Thomas and Samuel for Christmas dinner, with a table that Myrtle set with the best linen she had found in the house chest, and a meal she had been planning for 2 weeks. She had made a plum pudding from a recipe she had carried in her head from Ohio, and when she brought it out with the brandy sauce, Marcus looked at it, and then at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. "My mother made that," he said. Not with grief exactly, but with the texture of a man who has just been brought back to something he had given up expecting to encounter again. "I know," she said. "Ruth told me." He looked at her across the table in the candlelight, and she looked back at him, and Thomas and Samuel found pressing reasons to look at their plates, which was both diplomatic and unnecessary, because what was happening between those 2 was not the kind of thing that needed to be hidden. On Christmas evening, after Thomas and Samuel had gone to the bunkhouse, and the dishes were done, and the fire was banked for the night, they sat together on the settee in the front room in the firelight. She was leaning against his shoulder. His arm was around her. It was simple and complete, and she thought about the Myrtle Underwood of 14 months ago in a rented room in Cheyenne with $14 and 3 bread rolls, and she felt toward that woman an enormous tenderness, and a gratitude that the newspaper had been on the table and not in the stove. He was quiet for a long time, and she had learned enough of his silences to know this one was approaching something. "I do not want to pressure you," he said. "I know," she said. "But I want you to know that what I am feeling is not the feeling of a man who is content with things staying as they are." She tilted her head to look up at him. How do you mean? He looked back at her. I mean that I have been trying to find the right time to ask you properly. And I think that there is no right time. There is only the time you are brave enough to use. He shifted so that he could look at her fully. Myrtle Underwood, you arrived here under circumstances that were not entirely accurate, with a carpetbag and a secret and more courage than you knew you had. You have been on this property for 4 months, and in that time you have faced down a man who has been holding you hostage for 2 years. You have saved my water rights from a forged contract. You have learned to ride and to work cattle and to make bread at altitude with acceptable results, and you have managed to become the best part of every single day I have had since August. He paused. I would like to know if you will marry me. She looked at him for a moment in the firelight, and thought about all the reasons she had arrived telling herself she should not feel things she could not sustain. She thought about the wall she had built. She thought about the gap in it that had opened on the first morning with the view of the mountains and had widened day by day in the company of this particular, steady, infuriating, generous, honest man. Yes, she said, I will marry you. He kissed her in the firelight with the same deliberateness he brought to everything he cared about, and she kissed him back without a wall between them, without management or armor or the careful version of herself. Just herself, Myrtle Underwood, exactly as she was. They married in February, in the church that was also a school, with Sheriff Pollard and his wife as witnesses, and Ruth making the 2-day journey from the nearest rail stop through February, whether that she described afterward as a moral challenge she had not expected to pass. Thomas Bray stood in the back with Samuel Crow, and both of them wore their best clothes with the careful dignity of men who understood the weight of an occasion. The minister was a small, precise man named Reverend Haverson, who performed the ceremony with a warmth that suggested he found genuine pleasure in joining people who had clearly worked to deserve each other. Myrtle wore a dress she had ordered from Cheyenne, deep green wool that fit her properly and made her look, Ruth said with satisfaction, like a woman who knew exactly where she was and had chosen to be there. She carried a small bunch of dried flowers from her own garden, because February in Wyoming does not offer fresh ones, and she had pressed them in October specifically for this purpose, which she had not admitted to herself at the time was what she was doing. Marcus, across the church aisle, looked at her with the expression she had come to understand as his face in the presence of something he considered sacred, and she walked toward it without hesitation. The winter they had endured together, the frozen pipes and the hard work in Franklin Dray, and the forged contract, and the long evenings by the fire with books and coffee, and the particular pleasure of knowing someone deeply, broke in March with the tentative insistence of Wyoming spring. The ice on Cutter's Creek cracked and shifted with sounds like distant artillery, and the first patches of bare ground appeared on the south-facing slopes, and the horses in the corral began to move with the restless energy of animals who have been patient long enough. Myrtle stood on the porch in the March air and watched the ice go out on the visible section of the creek and felt something so full in her that she was not entirely sure how to contain it. Marcus came to stand behind her, his hands on her shoulders, his chin near her temple, and they looked at the creek together. It is over, she said, meaning the winter, meaning the danger, meaning the period of her life in which survival had been the primary occupation. Yes, he said. Now comes the rest of it. She reached up and covered his hands with hers. I stayed through the winter, she said. You did more than that, he said. She turned in his arms and looked up at him. You gave me somewhere worth staying, she said. He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes that she had been reading for months and would read for the rest of her life. You gave me a reason to want someone to stay, he said. The spring came fully in April, green and loud with returning birds, the mountains losing their snow except at the highest elevations. The cattle came up from the winter range moving fat and healthy, and Marcus rode the high pasture with the satisfaction of a man whose gamble on a hard season had paid out. Myrtle planted the garden with an expansiveness she had not attempted in the previous fall, staking out rows for vegetables she had wanted and had not thought to plant before because she had not been sure she would be there to harvest them. She was sure now. She received a letter from Clarence in April. It was postmarked from Colorado Territory, and it was short, characteristically so. He was alive. He was working in a silver camp. He was doing well, which she took to mean he was doing adequately and was not in immediate danger. He had heard from a reliable source, he wrote, and she did not ask how, that the trouble with Dre was resolved. He was glad. He was sorry. Was working on being better. She read the letter at the kitchen table and showed it to Marcus, who read it with his particular attention and set it down and said, "He is alive." "He is alive," she agreed. "That is enough for now," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She wrote back. Not with forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness of Clarence was a longer project than one letter could hold, but with the acknowledgement of his life and the information that she was married and well and the door left open. By the summer of 1879, the McCrae property had grown by 2 additional horses, a kitchen addition that Marcus built in June with Samuel's help that gave them a true parlor separate from the working room, and a dog named Biscuit who had appeared on the property in May with the inexplicable confidence of an animal who has identified the correct household and has arrived to take up residence. Biscuit was a medium-sized, indeterminate breed with strong opinions and excellent herding instincts, and a particular attachment to Myrtle that Marcus pretended to be neutral about and was not. Ruth visited again in July, this time bringing news from Texas. Their mother was well. Their middle brother Daniel was considering a move west, following the pattern of younger sons on worked-out Texas ranches who saw the territories as possibility rather than hardship. Ruth herself had a possibility of her own, a man in Galveston she described in the careful, non-committal language of a woman who is interested, but is not going to commit to being interested until the interest is clearly returned. Myrtle listened to this with enormous empathy and the specific satisfaction of a woman who has recently won her own gamble on a person and is privately rooting very hard for her sister-in-law. In August, precisely 1 year after her arrival in Cutter's Creek, Myrtle discovered she was expecting a child. She told Marcus in the morning, before breakfast, while they were both still in the kitchen with the first light coming through the windows and the coffee not yet made, because she had not wanted to wait for a better moment and had decided there was no better moment than the one available. She told him simply, standing by the stove, and he turned from where he was at the window and looked at her and said nothing for a moment that was long enough that she had time to wonder if she had miscalculated his response. Then he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her properly with his arms around her and his face in her hair, and she felt him breathe. "Well," he said finally against her hair. "Well," she agreed. He pulled back and looked at her. His eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before and that she found, for reasons she could not have articulated to anyone who had not been there for all the preceding months, the single most beautiful thing she had ever encountered. "Are you well?" he said. "I am entirely well," she said. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her forehead with such gentleness that she thought about Aliner's quilt on the bed in the room that had been hers before it became theirs, and she felt no jealousy, only gratitude, for the woman who had taught him how to be tender and left him here to use it. The pregnancy was not easy, in the way that first pregnancies often are not, with a persistent nausea through the early months and a period in October when she was more tired than she had ever been in her life. Marcus managed this with the same practical competence he brought to everything, taking on work she normally handled without comment or performance, appearing with food when she needed it, leaving her alone when she needed that, never making her feel diminished by the physical realities of her body doing a very large thing. Thomas Bray, who had been neutral for so long and had gradually become something approaching a friendly constant in the life of the property, said to Marcus one evening when Myrtle had gone to bed early and the 2 men were sitting on the porch with the September air coming off the mountains, She is something, that woman." "Yes," Marcus said. "You look different than you did a year ago," Thomas said. "I am different than I was a year ago," Marcus said. Thomas nodded, satisfied, and nothing more needed to be said. The baby came in the late spring of 1880, on a Thursday morning in early May when the land was green, and the garden was beginning to show its first shoots, and Biscuit was lying outside the bedroom door with an alert gravity that suggested he understood the situation better than he let on. The nearest doctor was 40 miles away, but there was a woman in the community, a farmer's wife named Margaret Fitch, who had delivered more babies in Cutter's Creek than anyone cared to count, and who arrived the evening before with the focused efficiency of someone who has done this many times and is not worried. It was a long labor, as first labors tend to be, and Marcus spent most of it in the hall outside the bedroom in a state of controlled anxiety that Thomas and Samuel periodically interrupted with tasks that were not strictly necessary, but served the purpose of keeping his hands occupied. At one point Myrtle heard him from the other side of the door, not speaking, just present, and she said loudly enough to be heard, "I am all right," and heard him exhale against the door. The baby came in the early morning with the first light arriving gray and pink through the eastern windows. A boy, healthy, loud, with a head of dark hair and an immediate and considerable opinion about his existence. Marcus came into the room when Margaret Fitch opened the door and looked at Myrtle in the bed with the baby in her arms, and stood in the doorway for a moment that she would remember clearly for the rest of her life. The specific quality of his face when he saw them both. The specific undoing of a man who has been controlled and competent and careful for longer than a person should have to be. Looking at the thing that costs all of that and gives back something so much larger. He came to sit beside her, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held him with a careful precision and looked down at him with the full, complete attention he gave to things he considered sacred. "Thomas," Myrtle said because she had been thinking about this. "For a name." Marcus looked at her. "Thomas. He has been loyal to you for years," she said, "and he deserves that." Marcus looked back down at the baby. "Thomas," he said quietly, trying it. Then to her, with the full quiet warmth of a man who has been given more than he expected, "Thomas it is." Thomas Bray, when he heard this from the doorway where he had been standing with his hat in his hands, did not say anything at all for a long moment. Then he cleared his throat once, firmly, and said, "That is a fine name for a fine boy," and went back to the yard because he needed a moment that was his own. Samuel Crow, who had heard everything, put his hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder as he passed and said nothing, which was the correct thing to say. The years that followed were good years, the kind that contained difficulty and weather and the ordinary challenges of a working life, but that are built on a foundation solid enough to hold what is put on it. Marcus and Myrtle McCrae worked their property through seasons that were sometimes hard and sometimes beautiful, and always their own. The ranch grew incrementally, as solid things do, not in dramatic leaps but through the steady accumulation of good decisions and honest work, and the willingness to be wrong when being wrong was the honest outcome. Little Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious child with his father's steadiness and his mother's quickness. He was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Clara, who arrived in the world with the confident determination of a second child, and who became, within 3 years, the particular authority on all household matters, a position she held without apology. Biscuit, who lived to an impressive age that the family attributed variously to good air and sheer personal conviction, was survived by 2 successors, both of whom maintained the tradition of arriving unannounced and assuming residency. Ruth married her man in Galveston, a steady, gentle person named Edwin who made her laugh with the frequency she deserved, and visited Wyoming every summer, arriving with children of her own in later years, and filling the house with the particular happy noise of a large, chosen family. Clarence came, eventually, in the spring of 1882. He was thinner than Myrtle remembered and older in the way that hard living ages a person, but he was sober and earnest and looked at Marcus McCrae with the careful assessment of a man who knows he is being evaluated and accepts the justice of it. Marcus evaluated him with his full, honest attention, and then shook his hand with the firmness of a man extending provisional trust, which was the most any reasonable person could ask. Clarence stayed for a month. He worked alongside Thomas and Samuel with the willingness of a man who understands he is earning something. When he left, he was not yet fully rebuilt, because that takes longer than a month, but he was building, and Myrtle watched him go down the road with a feeling that was not completion, because it was not complete, but was something warm enough to sustain the waiting. The winters in Cutter's Creek continued to be hard, as Wyoming winters are, and continued to be the most beautiful thing Myrtle had ever seen, as Wyoming winters also are. The first snows of each October came off the mountains with the authority of something that has been doing this for centuries and knows what it is about. And the house stood against them with the solidity of timber and good building, and the warmth of people who had chosen their location and intended to stay. She thought sometimes in those winter evenings when the children were in bed, and she and Marcus were at the kitchen table with their coffee and their books, and the dog asleep on the hearth, about the woman who had stood on that porch in October of 1878 with her carpetbag clutched to her chest, and the frozen grass at her feet, and a man she barely knew asking her to stay through the winter. She thought about the terror and the hope of that moment, the way it had felt like a precipice and a doorway at the same time. She was not that woman anymore, and yet she was entirely that woman, and the continuity between them was the most valuable thing she owned. One evening, with the second winter storm of December moving in off the mountains, and the house warm and full of the smell of the pine wood Marcus had split in November, and the supper she had made that was still hanging in the air, she came to stand beside him at the window where he was watching the snow start in the yard, the first flakes sparse and deliberate, and she put her hand in his. He closed his fingers around hers. He did not turn from the window because he knew she was watching the snow too. "I think about that morning," she said, "the porch." "Which morning?" he said, though she thought he knew. "When you asked me to stay through the winter," she said. "You said you were not asking me to stay forever." "I know what I said," he said. "You were being careful with me," she said. "You were giving me a way out." "I was giving you a choice," he said. "There is a difference." She thought about the distinction. "I would like to tell you something," she said. He turned to look at her then. "I would have stayed forever," she said. "Even then, I did not know it yet, but I would have." He looked at her in the window light with the snow beginning to thicken in the yard behind her, and the house full of their children's sleeping presence, and the dog shifting on the hearth, and the years of honest, full, chosen life behind them and ahead of them. "No," he said. He kissed her in the window with the snow coming down, and she kissed him back, and outside the winter moved in over the Laramie Range with the authority of a season that knows how to keep people close, and inside there was light and warmth, and the long, deep quiet of two people who found each other and held on. The creek would ice over again before January. The cattle would be moved to the winter range. Thomas would grumble about the fence rails, and Samuel would fix them without being asked. Clara would wake her parents at 5 in the morning to announce that it had snowed, and this was, in her judgment, a personal gift addressed specifically to her. Young Thomas would roll out of bed with the patient stoicism of an older child who has learned to manage his sister's enthusiasms. And Marcus McCrae and Myrtle Underwood McCrae would stand at the kitchen window in the early morning with their coffee and watch their land under its white covering and feel the full, unhurried weight of everything they had built, everything they had chosen, everything they had stayed for. She had arrived with a carpetbag and a secret and the desperate hope of a woman with $14 and nowhere in particular to go. She had stayed through the winter. She had stayed through every winter after. And the mountains stood behind the house the way they always had, indifferent and magnificent, and the snow came down the way it always had, and the creek ran beneath the ice the way it always would, and none of it cared whether any particular human being had arrived by choice or by necessity or by the blind chance of a newspaper on a table instead of in a stove. It was Myrtle who cared. She cared enough for all of it. She pressed her shoulder against her husband's arm in the window and looked at the white morning and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that the only real mistake she had ever made was the time she had almost thrown the paper in the stove.